at this roundtable will reflect a little bit on what this means for the region. Having said that, I think in some cases, a clear separation between these different concepts is not easy and will likely be case specific. Our goal is to reflect and try to answer the overarching question of how to end insurgencies in Africa, while recognizing that they are driven by various factors that include political marginalization, economic deprivation, and religious fundamentalism. I actually looked at a recent report from the Global Terrorism Index not too long ago. It was the 2020 version. And what was interesting in that report is that even though terrorism has fallen in most regions, it's actually become more widespread in others. And of particular relevance to us is the fact that of the 10 countries where we had seen the largest increase in terrorism, according to this report, 7 of them were in sub-Saharan Africa. And these include Burkina Faso, Mozambique, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mali, Niger, Cameroon, and Ethiopia. The report goes on to mention that these countries are facing various ecological threats. They are also characterized by high population growth and low societal resilience. Some of the economic or socioeconomic factors, rather, associated with terrorism across all countries include, for instance, high levels of group grievance and weak rule of law. And interestingly, if one were to consider less developed countries specifically, the report goes on to mention that religious or ethnic ruptures and corruption tend to be strongly associated with high levels of terrorism, which is quite different from the case of more advanced economies where factors such as social disenfranchisement and exclusion tend to play a more important role. What this tells us is essentially that the specific nature of insurgencies and terrorism in the African context need to be explored more carefully because of the specific nature, or if you will, root causes of why these are happening. And so while terrorism and insurgency are clearly important issues in the African context, I hope that the next 3 days will give us the opportunity to discuss the specificity of the African cases in particular. So let me close by saying that I hope that this virtual roundtable, which brings together members of academia, security policy institutions, nonprofits, security agencies, both within and outside the African continent, will address the effects of terrorism and insurgency on Africa's security and stability. I want to close also by saying that I wish all of us a productive roundtable, and I certainly will look forward to the discussion in the next 3 days. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Bello now, who will introduce the next speakers for this event.
Good morning, good afternoon once again. Kindly spare a couple of minutes. Join us, he's here to join us. We need a few minutes. While we're waiting for Ian, may we have Ms. Kaha Haji-Mohamed, Director for CSIDS.
Your connection is a little bit difficult. I'm not hearing you today, but I think I kind of figure out what you were saying. So I'm assuming you want Ms. Kaha Haji-Mohamed to say a few words, right? If she's on the call. Yes. Okay, I can see she's on the call. Yeah. From CDSN. Kaha, can you hear us? I don't hear anything. So should we move to the next speaker then?
I'll speak for her.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Sure. I'm Steve Seidman. I'm the director of the Canadian Defense and Security Network, and I'm a member of CSIDS. Kaha is apparently having mic issues, so it won't let her unmute. We're really happy to be the host of this event. CSIDS is Carleton's research center on security intelligence defense, and it's part of the larger Canadian Defense and Security Network that I am.
Sorry, folks. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. So you go ahead.
Hi there. So periodically I'm having my system kind of freeze and the mic not unmute for me, but I'm letting people in. Ariane, you asked me to stop the recording. I'm not sure if that's the request that you were looking for, but that's the message I got. Arianola? So it's recording. So it's recording. I'm not really sure what the request was that came through from you.
We want you to give your remark, Ma. Give your remark.
I wish I could, but it was cutting out, so I didn't get to hear what was said before me. I apologize.
Hello, Ma. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Kaha, I think you should just give your remarks. I don't think we should stop the recording. That was probably a misunderstanding.
Okay, so you guys know that I'm the director of CDSN, and I'm really interested in the presentations that are happening today. So I'm looking forward to listening in and contributing whenever I can.
So Ramez came back and he basically said that he's canceling.
I apologize if I said CDSN. I meant to say SIDS, but never mind. Go ahead.
Ms. Bello, do you know if our next speaker, Mr. Lallali, is on the call? I'm trying to see if I can find him on the list, but I can't.
I am indeed connected.
Samy.
Oh, great. So why don't you, oh, now we have also Mr. Stephane, Mr. Rolf Stephane and NGomat is also here. So I think I'm just going to go with the order in which people are listed on the program. So welcome, Mr. NGomat. We're delighted that you've been able to join us. So I will turn it over to you for your remarks.
Ok, merci encore pour cette opportunité que vous nous accordez de faire cette allocution de bienvenue. J'espère qu'il y a la traduction en anglais. Excellence, l'ambassadeur Bankole Adeoye, Commissioner for Peace Affairs, Peace and Security at African Union Commission, Monsieur Idriss Mounir Laila, Acting Director, African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism, Professor Yiagadeesen, Samy, NPSIA, Carleton University, Canada, Mrs. Kaha Haji-Mohamed, Director CSIDS, Carleton University, Mesdames et Messieurs, distingués participants, à vos rangs et grades, tout protocole observé. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, vivre en paix est une aspiration profonde des peuples africains. Cette aspiration constitue l'une des orientations phares de l'agenda 2063 de l'Union africaine, encore appelée l'Afrique que nous voulons. Dans cette optique, la préservation de la paix dépend non seulement de l'apport politique, économique ou militaire, mais surtout de l'engagement actif et profond et de tous citoyens unis dans leurs relations sociales et diversité multiforme. d'où l'importance de promouvoir la paix, qui est cet ensemble d'attitudes et de comportements qui reflètent le respect de la vie, de l'être humain et de sa dignité qui doivent être diffusées et pratiquées par chacun. Par ailleurs, l'insurrection, le terrorisme, les violences multiformes, les soulèvements ont fait de nombreuses victimes civiles et militaires en Afrique et causent la vie de nombreux Africains. Ces victimes viennent s'ajouter à celles enregistrées par la COVID-19 et de nombreux migrants à la Méditerranée. Mesdames et messieurs, Excellences, mesdames et messieurs, j'aimerais également souligner ici l'importance de nous réunir ici et également de saluer la collaboration entre l'ECOSSOC, le Conseil économique, social et culturel de l'Union africaine, le Norman Paterson School of International Affairs de Carleton University, ainsi que le Centre d'études et d'intelligence de la défense, également tous les partenaires qui ont bien voulu organiser ce colloque. Sur ce, je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous la cordiale bienvenue à cette table ronde sous le thème « Prévenir, déterminer et vaincre l'insurrection en Afrique ». Ce colloque se tient également dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre des aspirations de l'agenda 2063 de l'Union africaine et de son initiative, l'agenda pour la paix. Aussi dans le cadre de partenariats qui exhortent les États membres à accroître la représentation des organisations de la société civile à tous les niveaux de décision dans les mécanismes des institutions nationales, régionales et internationales pour la prévention, la gestion et la résolution des conflits, ainsi que la fin de l'insurrection. En effet, ce colloque se tient dans le cadre également de la formule de Livingstone, qui est un mécanisme d'interaction entre les organisations de la société civile et l'Union africaine qui vise à encourager les ONG, les organisations communautaires et professionnelles, en particulier les organisations des femmes, des jeunes, à participer activement aux efforts visant à promouvoir la paix, la sécurité et la stabilité en Afrique. Il prévoit que le Conseil économique et social de l'Union africaine, l'ECOSSOC, qui est un organe consultatif chargé de coordonner la participation des OSC aux travaux de l'Union africaine, en particulier le département paix et sécurité de l'ECOSSOC, pour jouer le rôle de coordination dans cette interaction. Excellences, mesdames et messieurs, ce colloque vise en outre à mettre en place des mécanismes afin de mettre fin à l'insurrection en Afrique par la prévention, la dissuasion et la contrainte. Cela aidera à examiner certaines des conclusions de la recherche 2009 par RAND Corporation et sa pertinence pour le présent et l'avenir et les exigences pour promouvoir la paix et la sécurité en Afrique. Ceci étant, l'engagement actif des citoyens et des OSC est un atout indéniable pour la paix et la fin de l'insurrection en Afrique. Il est donc temps de changer les anciens paradigmes et de les remplacer par de nouveaux, ainsi que par exemple, au lieu de continuer à dire qui veut la paix prépare la guerre, nous devons plutôt dire qui veut la paix prépare la paix. Je voudrais pour conclure exprimer notre solidarité à tous les belligérants qui se battent corps et âme dans leurs pays et régions respectives pour mettre fin aux insurrections, ainsi que pour que la paix et la stabilité soient une réalité en Afrique. Je vous remercie. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur NGomat, and let me thank you also for making the link with Agenda 2063 and also for highlighting the work that your organization is doing. In particular, I think your point about preparing for peace is an important one, as well as the engagement of all actors, including the participation of citizens in that process. So thank you again. And with that, I'm going to now ask Mr. Idriss Mounir Lallali, Acting Director, African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism, to offer some remarks.
Thank you,
Mr. Lallali.
Thank you, Chair. Excellency, the Commissioner of Political Affairs, Peace and Security, Professor Teddy Samy. Excellency Stephane NGomat, Ms. Kaha, Haji-Mohamed, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to start by thanking the organizers for inviting the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism and for granting us this unique opportunity to be taking part in this three-day roundtable and offering us so many opportunities to share with you our insights and views. It is indeed an honor, and we hope to be up to the expectations. The threat of terrorism and violent extremism in Africa is more than a reality. We are reminded daily of its relevance and its persistence, spreading at an exponential rate geographically, in frequency, and in lethality. It is anticipated that this trend will continue its upward progression in the short to medium term. Regions and countries that previously did not perceive the seriousness of the threat or were considered to be immune from terrorism have indeed suffered the consequences of the threat. The alliances and vast networks built by terrorist groups, thanks mainly to their relationship with transnational organized crime, have enabled them to progress, redeploy, and expand at an alarming rate. The substantial financial resources resulting from all forms of crime in which terrorists are engaging have increased their capacity to acquire highly sophisticated weapons and ammunition, recruit new members, and expand their support networks and zones of operations. This new configuration has resulted in strengthening the human resource capacity and technical capacities of these groups, and most importantly, their ability to venture into new territory, which explains their rapid expansion on the African continent. Indeed, the terrorist threat continues to exhibit dynamism, changing in nature, tactics, modus operandi, scope, target, actors, recruitment, funding methods, and methodology. It is in this regard that I wish to reiterate that effective response to terrorism requires coordinated responses that strengthen state capacities to prevent and combat terrorism while addressing conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. What's most important also, and I think within the course of the next 3 days, is to be able to identify and define the problem that we have at hand. Because the definition of the problem will allow us to adapt the proper approach, but also to suggest the proper courses of action. As when we talk about terrorism, it's completely different from counterinsurgency. However, some methods and techniques could be interchangeable in that respect. The international, transnational, and trans-regional and cross-border nature of the threat imposes the need for enhanced international cooperation and coordination, as no single country or continent can effectively prevent and counter it alone. It is therefore, this therefore calls for enhanced efforts to strengthen mechanisms for effective sharing of information and intelligence between the concerned countries at bilateral, regional, and international levels. Moreover, this is where the role of mechanisms put in place by the African Union, such as the Nouakchott and Djibouti process, for instance, the different regional fusion centers, the Committee for Intelligence and Security Services, and more recently, AFRIPOL, become crucial, relevant, and critical. Effective prevention and combating of terrorism require renewed determination from member states to meet their obligations under the different regional and global counterterrorism instruments. Moreover, support and facilitation for the development of technical and operational capacities of member states for effective prevention and combating of terrorism is required in many areas. The development of comprehensive counterterrorism train-the-trainer programs and manuals ensure technical capacity building, which is sustainable and which could be owned and implemented by the respective member states. Despite the very many remaining challenges for an effective implementation of the EU counterterrorism agenda and framework, the Commission continues to work with its partners to mobilize technical and financial resources to support the capacity building of member states to ensure that we meet the objectives of Agenda 2063 in terms of peace and security. I thank you very much for your kind attention and wish us collectively a robust, fruitful deliberation. And I will certainly have many opportunities to intervene in the course of the next 3 days. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lallali, for your remarks. And also great that you were able to pick up on the definitional issue, which I think is an important one. I think this was a point that I mentioned earlier, and also we stressed in our letter of invitation for the need to differentiate different types of violence and the context-specific nature of each one of those. I'm sure the experts on this roundtable will be able to provide some remarks about this as they have implications for how to address them. And I think what we were getting at in our invitation was really about the context-specific nature of violence and how it is difficult sometimes to disentangle insurgency from terrorism, from civil wars, etc. So I certainly look forward to some elaboration on that topic. So without further ado, let me now invite our keynote speaker to offer some remarks. We're delighted to be joined this afternoon by Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, who's the Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security with the AU Commission in Addis Ababa. So Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, for having me, and I'm very pleased to be here. I really also want to thank my brother, Major General Ishala Williams, retired, as well as other distinguished participants, including my colleague, Idriss, who just spoke. It is indeed an honor to address you today in my capacity as the African Union Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security. 6 months ago, I took office, and one critical factor has been, just as your topic says, how best can we actually prevent, deter, and defeat terrorism, insurgency, and I will leave the definitional issues later on to you as experts. It is also necessary to appreciate our organizers because it gives us a glowing opportunity to reflect on the progress made and the shortcomings we have seen in lessons learned in the past 20 years since the horrendous 9/11 attacks. And of course, 20 years since also the adoption of the landmark United Nations Security Council Resolution 1373 of 2001. What is upon us is what I call the globalization of violence, expressed in terrorism, violent extremism, insurgency, insurrection, in rebellion, and in all shades, which Africa has continued to face. So the threat is real, it is resilient, it is persistent, unfortunately, and it's expanding. And like Idriss said, very likely to continue for the foreseeable future. The geography of terrorism and insurgency in Africa has indeed seen a dramatic change over the past decade. The threat has assumed greater proportions. Regions that we did not perceive as being part of their threat network are also now reeling and targeted by terrorists. It has spread from north to south, east to west, and central, including the Sahel. Terrorism has expanded, of course, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. And more recently, it has expanded its tentacles to the South African region in Mozambique. It is at this reason why a number of scholars always contend that terrorism as a political violence phenomenon is geographically based, it is place-bound, and location-specific. And that is factual. Having traveled to many parts of Africa, just recently in Mozambique, I would say both the governed and the ungoverned spaces, geographical spaces, in the 5 regions of our continent are being taken over like terrorists and insurgents. The regional hotspots are from the farthest and innermost parts of the Sahel and the southern Libyan border areas, serve as a playground for ISIS, Al-Qaeda, G5 Sahel is contending these forces, including the French-led Operation Bankole, which is being closed, as we understand, as well as the EU-coordinated Operation Takuba. These forces are fighting in the Sahel to make sure that we effectively counter terrorism. Likewise, the Tumbuns, which are mini islands in the Lake Chad Basin, serve as a home for Boko Haram, for ISWAP, displaying the temerity of taunting the counter-terrorism forces. It is also the same in the Cabo Delgado province of northern Mozambique, a battleground for so-called ISIS-affiliated terrorist groups. And indeed, the geography of the insurgency and terrorism in Africa reflects the long-standing relationship of fighting in the Horn of Africa, particularly Somalia, where it has been a long-standing battle between AMISOM, the Somali security forces, and Al-Shabaab. Therefore, as you can see from our geography, that Al-Qaeda, the so-called Islamic State, affiliated groups remain dominant terrorist and violent extremist groups operating on the continent. These groups have international terrorism agenda or seek opportunities and alliances and domestic terrorist networks to carry out and entrench their dominance. They tend to hold territory where they launch and sustain asymmetric warfare on security forces and local communities perceived to be of different faiths or supporters of government. In essence, African terrorist groups profess the rejection of secular governance and consider the spread of their belief in an extremist way of life as divine justification for their use of any means, including violence, to achieve their goals. Usually, the evolution of terrorism in Africa is associated with the closure of schools, with the teaching and the preaching of the ideology of hate and violence, and thereby creating the extremist doctrine that has become the primary scheme for many local communities. These groups espouse local grievances for recruitment purposes and gain the support of local communities. They also indeed occupy both the physical geographical space as well as the cyberspace. Their online propaganda levels have increased as well as the quality of their media outputs, a la ISIS when it was first active in the Levant. They are expanding their zones of operation and their zones of influence. As a means of winning the support of local communities in many areas under their control, they do not only instill fear, but seek to erode the trust between governments and their population by providing facilities and utilities, indeed rendering justice the way they believe should be delivered, as you have Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Distinguished participants, while they are known to receive external support from groups and governments with similar fundamentalist worldview, these terrorist groups run criminal economies, symbolic in a symbiotic relationship with transnational organized crime, as Idriss had mentioned. Indeed, for example, Boko Haram is reported to impose taxes on farmers on a hit and run basis. It is also known many parts of the Sahel that kidnap for ransom is on the increase, along with illegal exploitation of natural resources, including livestock trafficking, and in addition to drug trafficking, as well as other organized crimes. These organized crimes have become, indeed, the centerpiece of the terror-driven economies in most parts of Africa facing this. At the operational level, we also see the use of small arms and light weapons. Their reliance on the use of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and suicide bombs, particularly vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, and person-borne improvised explosive devices, to cause massive casualties that has become devastating and should, of course, be of deep concern to all peace-loving Africans, the African Union, the regional economic communities, and the world at large. Counterterrorism efforts have thus far been able to degrade the will, the cohesion, the capacity of these groups to launch debilitating attacks on both security forces and civilian communities. This is work in progress. Distinguished participants, the security threats faced by many African Union member states in Somalia, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Chad, Mali, and so on, continue to threaten both human, national, and regional security. It is important that we fight this instability because it is also spreading to neighboring countries which have hitherto not experienced it. The civil war in Libya, as well as the crisis in Mali, became a threat multiplier in a region already confronted with governance deficit, structural challenges of poverty, weak judicial system, and limited socioeconomic opportunities. It is for this reason that, dear participants, that with the background that we provided, I would like to emphasize a number of issues that will address early response based on two principles of an effective counterterrorism strategy and the essence of focusing on post-conflict reconstruction and development. First, given the global reach of terrorist organizations and groups, we must collectively strive to provide a stronger framework for multilateral cooperation, for regional cooperation, a forum for dialogue and support and engagement. In this vein, regional and international cooperation remain vital. This is what the African Union Commission is prioritizing. Second, we must continue to strengthen prevention as a core priority of the African Union as part of its overall counter-terrorism strategy. The full weight of the African Union early warning system, as well as other instruments, including a center in Algiers and Africa, will be brought to bear in our efforts to tackle effectively and defeat and deter this menace. Early warning must translate into early response and early action. My third point, going forward, it is imperative to engage women, young people, as critical players in efforts to combat terrorism. The full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in the creation and development of policy is critical to building resilience and to countering terrorism with all our might. This will be part of what we can emphasize as strategic communication between the security forces, the military and intelligence, and the local populace. Lastly, it is important that we address the structural root causes, poverty, discrimination that contribute, in sometimes marginalization that contribute to terrorism and fuel its spread. Consequently, we must address the nexus between peace, security, and development to be at the center of our global counterterrorism strategies. This is very, very critical. Afghanistan has taught us a lesson that it cannot just be one size fits all. It has also taught us that just the hardcore military response will not lead to the defeat of terrorist groups and their cohorts. We must prioritize de-radicalization. We must address the structural roots, like I stated. We must build, like Nigeria is doing with the Northeast Development Corporation, just like Mozambique is doing with its national commission dealing specifically with the development of the gas-rich Cabo Delgado province. We must make sure that we learn from each other. As we adopt these processes as well as instruments, it is necessary that the AU remains solidly behind the international community and vice versa. I urge you as practitioners in this field to join the AU in preventing, in defeating, and in deterring this phenomenon called terrorism or insurgency or both. It is un-African for us. Terrorism is definitely not in our character. We urge our regional economic communities, regional mechanisms, African people, women, youth, and children to promote the ideals of Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance, because this terrorism ideology of hate is anathema to the aspirations and goals of Agenda 2063. I thank you so much.
Thank you very much for these remarks, Ambassador. Thank you for providing us with a comprehensive overview of the geography of terrorism and insurgency across the continent. I noted in particular your focus on developing a stronger framework for multilateral and regional cooperation, the role that the AU can play in this process. I think your remarks about having not only an early warning system, but also early response is key. We'll get a chance, I think, in the next 3 days to look at some of these regional and case-specific insurgencies and terrorism in future panels. And I also noted your remarks about the need to engage women and young persons in that process. And finally, to focus on the structural root causes. So I think these are all extremely important elements that you've provided us to reflect on in the next few days. It's 9:13 on my watch, so we still have a few minutes before 9:30. So we have about 15 to 17 minutes if my watch is correct. So why don't I open it up now for questions or comments based on what we've heard so far. I don't see anything in the chat box, but if people have a question, just turn on your mic and go ahead. And I'll try to moderate as best I can if there are too many people at the same time. So does anyone have any sort of quick reactions to what has been said? I see in the chat box that someone is asking for a copy of the, I guess you're asking for a copy of his speech. So I'll let Ms. Bello respond to that. So does anyone want to comment, or do you have questions about what has been said?
Good morning, good afternoon once again. Thank you, Ambassador Adeoye. for the beautiful keynote address. I just want to make like a clarification on PAPS and deterring insurgency. So I would just like you to give a few points on how you intend to use women and children, because I know all over the world, women and children are part of the major stakeholders. They always are on the receiving end when we have serious insurgency. How do you intend to use women and the children to help resolve this big issue of insurgency? Thank you, sir.
Chair, can I respond?
Yes, please go ahead, Ambassador. Sorry, I didn't. Please go ahead.
No, thank you very much for that question. It's very apt, it's very practical. And one of the instruments, we have a number of instruments. We have just established a very, very strong mediation and dialogue division in the new structure of the African Union. But over the years, we have been moving women leaders to specific regions in the Lake Chad Basin, in the Sahel, in Somalia, in collaboration with the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Madam Amina Mohamed, and our own Special Envoy for Women, Peace and Security. So we are taking women leaders to areas, the theaters of war. In some cases, the women leaders, through what we call FemWise. FemWise is a network of women organizations on the continent, particularly working in the field of mediation, of dialogue, of reconciliation, and to ensure that consultations across the board in different parts of our conflict zones really work. So now, FemWise is also being transformed. In the last 6 months, we have come up with a conceptual framework for what I call YouthWise. Yes, we have not used the youth as we had used the FemWise. So these mechanisms all speak to what we call the grand mechanism is the panel of the wise, which is like an elders council, but has been very difficult for it to operate because member states deny that there are issues evolving when it comes to early warning, early response, and when we want to take early action. So we decided that at least they will not say no to FemWise, which is a group of women organizations across the continent working in the peace and security sector. So we have done this in a way that we are re-energizing and we are restructuring to address the issues of the time. In conflicts that are internal, civil war, it's easier to undertake mediation and dialogue processes, but not in terrorist or deadly insurgency zones. But we know that it is necessary for these groups under the AU umbrella to move to the actual spaces and leave the necessary political diplomatic zones of conferences. So we are taking them to that to the zones where the action is. A team from my office just returned from 3 countries where we have undertaken multidimensional supports to assess the needs of countries in political transition and post-conflict. And now we want to really activate that to the level of active conflicts and where women can take the lead role in addressing the youth. You remember that the youth are both perpetrators and indeed sometimes mediators in crisis. So they are victims, they are perpetrators, and now we want to use them more under this new youth-wise mechanism as that. For children, that is even a passion for me, because I had the experience in 2017 to have met some of the then recently released schoolgirls from Chibok. And we met them, and I saw girls like my own daughters carrying babies when they themselves were still babies. And that touched me. I returned to Addis Ababa then as ambassador. I set up the group of friends on children affected by armed conflict. Now, I have turned that as commissioner to African platform on children affected by armed conflict. And what is the objective? Is to advocate, to bring to the fore, to serve as the vanguard for issues affecting the rights and the welfare of children who are caught in conflict zones. For us to discuss and promote how best our schools can be safer. In Abuja, at the end of October, there will be the 4th international conference with a number of partners, including Save the Children. So this is what we are doing practically to get the voice of the voiceless, the vulnerable, to actually engage in areas that we know for sure. But I must admit, the geography of terrorism and insurgency shows us that it is a huge task. But I can assure you that we have brave women, brave young men who are ready, committed already to be working. And with our platform on children affected by armed conflict, I want to assure you that our aspirations for a peaceful, a more secure Africa, more democratic in the Agenda 2030 is doable. It will take time, but it's doable. I thank you.
Thank you very much for responding to this question. Do we have another question? Does anyone want to come in? If not, maybe I will ask you, Ambassador, to maybe talk a little bit about how you see, because you've talked about a stronger framework for both multilateral and regional cooperation. Can you offer us some quick sort of reflections on what the elements of this framework would be? In particular here, I'm thinking more on the multilateral side, because you've already spoken a little bit about the regional aspect with the AU. So would you be able to provide us some elements of this multilateral framework? And I also have two other hands, so maybe we can take other questions right away. So I have Professor Olorun Toba and then General Williams. So
I just want to direct 2 quick points to the ambassador and Mr. Lallali. One is that we are not paying enough and serious attention to this issue of boys. And why am I saying so? You have special programs for the girl child. I understand the vulnerability of the girls, but the girls don't carry guns in most cases. The girls are not involved in violent crimes in most cases. Most of our girls in Africa are not involved in gangs. They cannot be recruited by terrorists, except in some very, very few cases. And they cannot be recruited as insurgents also. There's a need for a special program for boys in Africa in a way that will take them away from even considering joining gangs, being part of terrorists, and being part of insurgency. Very serious. But every time one raises the issue, nobody wants to talk about it. They keep talking about youth. No, it's not a matter of youth, it's a matter of special program for boys. That's number one. And if we don't do that, there's no way we can solve this problem. Second point is that Africans don't learn from each other. They don't learn. And what do I mean by that? There are counterinsurgency going on in Mali. Algeria has managed to solve this problem to a great extent. Nigeria has a Chad problem and things like that. They don't meet on a regular basis on the platform regionally or with CAERT in Algiers to look at their various experiences, some of the solutions they have found to these experiences. What are the things that they can work together? Mozambique has gone to Rwanda. Rwanda is doing well in Mozambique. Wagner from Russia and the private military company for South Africa had to run away from Mozambique because they couldn't cope with the problem. What is Rwanda doing in Mozambique that is making them to succeed? And how can Africans learn from that? Mali wants to go and get Wagner that has failed in Mozambique, that is creating problems in Central Africa. Is there something wrong with us? Are we thinking at all? There's a serious need for AU to resource the African Center for Research and Study into Terrorism to look into some of these areas and to call regular meetings where people can share experiences and find a way to solve this solution. We can't continue like this.
Thank you very much for your comments, General. Maybe we can take one more question from Professor Oloruntoba, and then I'll turn it over to you, Ambassador, to respond. Samuel.
Prof, and thanks for organizing this. Although I'm not an expert on security, but I just want to touch on two things. The first is the political economic angle to the crisis of insurgency in Africa, and the question of elite benefits from this quagmire. 3 years ago, I asked former President Mbeki of South Africa, why is it that since you left office, the whole African agenda that you, President Obasanjo, the president of Algeria promoted seems to be absent on the agenda? And then he said, we asked you a question, who is supplying resources to the refugee in Uganda and in Kenya? I said, I don't know. Then he gave me the answer, which I won't mention here. What do we do to the profiting, the elite profiteering from insurgency? The second thing is the issue of culture. It seems to me that there's a culture in Africa that are accommodative of this of terrorism. How do we address that? The last thing is about the issue of gun. We've talked so much about silencing the gun, small arms coming to Africa. What is the AU response from the point of view of Russia proliferation of arms to Africa and other actors, France and all of them? Is there any independent of thought? Is there any independent of action to call these actors to order and to ask that, can we get Africa moving beyond the meager profit from supply of arms? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, I'll ask you maybe to speak for about 5 minutes and respond as best you can to some of these. You don't have to answer to all of them, but I think we should be able to get back to some of these questions as well later on. So why don't you try and do your best in the next 5 minutes or so? Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I think indeed you have saved me from answering the tough questions. So, but really, first, the elements of multilateral cooperation. First, must be based on the principles of partnership, equality, equity, mutual trust, mutual action, and what I call mutual responsiveness. This must be the hallmark of how AU can genuinely and faithfully engage the multilateral system on combating terrorism and violent extremism. It's been done, but we know that even in the UN, there's been no internationally acceptable definition. But we know what terror is. Terror is terror. And we know what insurgency is. Indeed, I do not use insurgency for Boko Haram because they use the insurgency tactics when it suits them. But they are basically a terror-minded organization like ISIS. So when the academia, the international media use these terms and insurgency, it gives the impression that we are lowering the bar just to suit some of the emphasis on what is not tenable. Second, the elements must also of in multilateral cooperation must also be very pro-African. It must genuinely emphasize institutional cooperation and using the instruments. We have an enhanced partnership framework on peace and security with the UN. But when it's time for the UN to appoint a special envoy for Libya, Libya, as far as I know, remains an African country. The African leaders called for joint special envoy, joint envoy for Libya, so that the AU and the UN will work together. It was turned down. These are the facts. We must also scale up the partnership between the United Nations Security Council and the Peace and Security Council. That collaboration must be genuine, must be pragmatic, and must be context focused. Currently, it is lame. It's a lame duck. It's struggling to really work, even though it is enshrined in the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council of the AU. So joint visits to, as you know, almost 2/3 of the agenda of the Peace and Security Council, of the UN Security Council, is African. So how can the voice of Africa be left out in the multilateral system by the largest global platform on this? Finally, on the elements, you cannot do without definitely talking about predictable and sustainable financing. That is the hallmark, that's the centerpiece to defeat terrorism and all these factors. And this is why we really believe that you will need to really emphasize this. Access to UN assessed contributions for AU peace support operations, particularly in countering terrorism, will be ideal. Let me end by saying I agree with General Williams. Definitely, I'm a champion for what is called he for she. The UN has been working on that, and we must also pay good attention and great attention to boys as well, because they are being used as child soldiers, as we know, in many parts of our continent. The lesson learning event indeed is exactly, you read my mind. We are already working on this, and we are bringing together MNJTF, AMISOM, the G5 Sahel Joint Force, the mission for observers in Central Africa, which is AU, and the recently deployed SADC standby force to Mozambique. Where, as you said, I just returned from Mozambique, and I discovered the challenges of MNJTF, the challenges of AMISOM are the same as the recently deployed one. So, General, you're absolutely right. We have to work together. And the last speaker, I fully agree with you. I spent 8 of my years in Nepal. The political and the economy of our continent needs to be reviewed and taking leadership, because the terrorist network, they're taking over everything. We really subscribe to the culture of peace. We just celebrated the International Peace Day of Peace, and we emphasize that the culture of peace is also the culture that accepts zero tolerance for unconstitutional changes of government. On small arms and light weapons, I can assure you that the AU is modestly getting there with new DDR and SSR policy frameworks and interventions. We have deployed SSR experts to Gambia, recently to Lesotho, and we are now deploying them to Libya in the next few days. I want to assure you that the most important factor is for our member states, when it comes to small arms and light weapons, to subscribe to the Arms Trade Treaty, the UN International Convention, to really control the usage. And that is why this September, I must not forget, is what we call the Amnesty Month in the AU, to ensure that those who are ready to voluntarily surrender their weapons, member states should encourage this as a way of ridding our streets, our towns, our villages, our urban centers of deadly small arms and light weapons. I thank you.
Thank you once again, Ambassador, for generously giving us your time this morning. I did note that there were a few questions in the chat box, in particular, the sole reliance on militarized response. I think you've partly touched this issue with AMISOM in Somalia. I'm hopeful we'll be able to come back to this, because I noted in your remarks that you indicated the need for a more comprehensive approach as well. So I think that kind of addresses that question, but I do see that it's a little bit more specific. So perhaps Mr. Gass, we will come back to this question in a later session. And if we don't, please remind me when we get a chance, because I do want to give everyone a chance to have their voices heard and their questions answered as much as possible. So with that, let me close this session and thank all the speakers. I've been asked by my colleague, Steve Seidman, that we should leave the meeting for 5 minutes and come back so that his technical staff can initiate the translation, which is not currently available. So if you can please leave a meeting and then log in, come back in 5 minutes, Steve, is that right? We should be able to have translation. And then we'll start with the other session, which will be chaired by Mr. Lallali.
Yes, I'm really sorry about the translation problems. We had some hiccups this morning, but we'll get it worked out hopefully. And so we're gonna close the meeting now and just try to log in and about 5 minutes from now, and we should be able to get going with the second session. Again, my apologies.
Okay, thank you. So I will see you all in 5 minutes.